few months back, the video game Dead Rising gained renewed public interest when a deluxe remaster of the game was released. This includes myself, although I was quite late to the party as I watched the Crowbcat video covering the flaws of the remaster about a month or two after it came out. I had always been aware of Dead Rising, but since it was an Xbox, a system which I've never had, staple, and a rather niche dude bro action-y game, I never thought to play it. But it was Crowbcat's video, as well as the recommendation of a very good friend of mine who adores the game, that finally gave me the impetus to pick up the original Dead Rising. And I fell madly in love with it. It feels great to play. Finding creative ways to kill zombies and reach your goals is awesome. While rescuing incompetent AI survivors and defeating some needlessly beefy psychos was annoying, it ultimately felt satisfying when I finally did it. Whenever you hear someone praise Dead Rising, those are the general points they talk about. Killing zombies, managing your time, saving survivors, beating psychopaths, maximizing your prestige points, getting all the achievements, and figuring out the playstyle that suits you best. One thing, however, that I've noticed a lack of discussion around is the game's writing. Dead Rising is incredible because you can play how you want, and that includes being able to ignore the main story completely. If you want to mess around all the whole time, you can, which I love that, but what drew me into Dead Rising was ultimately the story. Seeing as no one that I've found has made a substantial video covering what makes Dead Rising's writing so great, that's what I'm going to do today. My main idea is that, while Dead Rising's gameplay is a major part of its enjoyability, it's ultimately its well-written narrative that gives it a foundation to stand on. Frankly, your value of my critique may vary depending on what you like about Dead Rising. As you can tell, I got a lot out of the story, but some players don't care about that. However, what I'm trying to say with this video is that one should not look over the game's thoughtful and well-constructed narrative. And to be clear, I will only be referring to the OG/2016 remaster. I refuse to talk about the deluxe remaster where Frank is built like a Roblox character and sounds like SpongeBob.
You know how to use that gun?
I've never fired at a person.
This is trash.
I also will not be comparing 1's writing to 2 or Off the Record because, while I have a feeling those games go through a tonal shift, I have not played them yet, so it's not fair for me to critique them.
That guy kinda cracked me up.
Anyway, to back up my argument for this video, I'll be focusing on the tone of the game's overall story, survivors and psychos, and the main character Frank West. As you may have seen from the title of this video, I believe the thing that makes Dead Rising's writing stand out is one particular trait. That trait is Gravitas. Because I want this to feel like a proper video essay, Gravitas is a term that comes from the Romans which denotes the virtue of seriousness. It now tends to be used to describe anyone that handles themselves with dignity or solemnity. I've always thought of it as a person who understands the gravity of the situation they're in. Frank even makes a sarcastic remark about something like this at one point in the game.
Well, we're up to our necks in zombies. Yeah, I think I appreciate the situation just fine.
As snide as this comment is, Frank really does get it, as do the other key characters and, most important of all, the writers behind Dead Rising. While the game can easily be viewed through the satirical, sometimes black comedy lens, what with the Dawn of the Dead style premise and commentary on American consumerism, not even accounting for the goofiness that can result on player input, Dead Rising's main story and central figures are ultimately played straight, which makes the latter point all the stronger thanks to the contrast between it and the less serious parts of the game. Now that I've set the stage, I'll start discussing each of the areas where Dead Rising does the best job of displaying its gravitas. To be extra clear if I wasn't already, this video will not discuss gameplay or mechanics or anything technical, but rather narrative and character analysis. So that means the best place to start this analysis is the game's story. It's a straightforward premise. A zombie outbreak happens in a small town and the player, as an intrepid photojournalist, has to uncover the mystery of what caused the outbreak. As I mentioned previously, the game is rather satirical. Players may recognize this initially when they consider the fact that these hordes of mindless, flesh consumers are infesting a giant American shopping mall. Again, very George Romero, Dawn of the Dead. However, it becomes even more apparent when the truth of the outbreak is revealed. The zombie plague came to be because a group of American scientists were trying to figure out a way to increase meat production. Somehow, trying to test cattle production led to a zombie wasp parasite thing. It's somewhat in your face, but it's nonetheless a biting commentary on the power grabbing of the American government, as it's also revealed that the initial testing for this experiment took place in Santa Cabeza, a Mexican village, and not on US soil. This resulted in the deaths of the entire village, minus the two people who brought the outbreak to Willamette, Carlito and Isabella. The US government also covers up the Santa Cabeza incident by claiming it was the center of the drug trade, and even tries to cover up the Willamette incident in Dead Rising's true ending.
The government wouldn't do that. Oh yes, they would.
The subsequent Willamette outbreak, therefore, was not some random accident, but rather an act of revenge. This turns the story on its head from being about the plight of these innocent Americans to a punishment for their greed and overconsumption.
Do you
have any idea how much meat Americans consume in a single day.
By the end of the game, it's no longer Carlito, an outside terrorist, being the big bad of Willamette. It's the United States' government and their corruption that becomes the true villain, with Brock representing this institution by the game's end.
Humanity has proven itself to be quite adept at making mistakes. Ha! Hell, it's the only thing we truly excel at.
The commentary here ties directly into the overarching themes of the game and the horror that surrounds it. However, not everything is so black and white. It is not as though Carlito only tried to target government buildings or figures. He chose a town full of innocents that had nothing to do with the experiments. The writers also make him lose a lot of sympathy points when he shoots Isabella, his own sister, out of rage, and shows he's pretty much a psycho himself. Carlito's sympathy is done no better considering the player takes control of Frank West, who tries to help the two DHS agents Brad and Jesse, Americans who know nothing about the Santa Cabeza incident. The player's perspective of the game takes place exclusively through these characters. As a result, players will much more easily side with them. Here's where the gravitas for all this comes in. If this game were nothing but satire, there wouldn't be so many moral shades of grey involved. We can feel bad for Carlito, but he still caused thousands of people to die and, we later find out, tried to cause a zombie outbreak across the US. This game lets you ponder this conflict and, by the end, the government and Carlito are more or less as bad as one another.
All they do is eat and eat and eat, growing in number. Just like you good red, white, and blue Americans.
What makes the story work is that the characters take all of this conflict seriously. There's not much joking around between Frank, Brad, Jesse, and Isabella, aside from a lighthearted or snarky comment here and there. They know lives are at stake, and they're there to remind the player just as much.
Special Forces will arrive for cleanup at midnight. They'll take everyone out. Zombies, people, everyone.
Now, I did not want to compare this game to Escape from New York since I just did a whole separate video about that movie, but they are very similar in the sense that, while there is definitely satire and a sprinkle of humor here and there, the characters take everything at face value. Like Escape from New York, the main character is taking this situation seriously and not making self-aware comments at things that we, the audience, might find ridiculous gives it gravitas. In both game and film, this gravitas allows the narrative to move beyond satire and into a more meaningful, timeless experience. Outside of the main story, there's another major factor of the game that gives Dead Rising gravitas. While I said I wouldn't talk about gameplay, the survivors and psycho's survivability in the game influences the story. Let's talk about survivors first. To clarify, there is no direct correlation between saving/failing to save survivors and the story being altered unless the survivor is tied to a main case, which is rare. However, assuming you play through the game blind or even mostly blind, it's impossible for you to save everyone. Again, you can beat the entire main story without rescuing a single survivor outside of the key characters, but this mechanic adds to the game's gravitas. It forces you as the player to choose who to save. On some runs, you'll have to choose between saving one person over another, or may lose a scoop chance altogether if you don't have enough resources to get them or guide them back to the security room. On your first run, you'll more than likely have to miss many scoop chances, meaning let survivors die. It doesn't help that getting a so-called perfect run where you save every survivor is quite difficult. Another factor that makes it even darker is that, if a survivor in your party dies, a gory cutscene plays where they are either eaten alive by zombies or turned into one themselves. That's pretty dark for a game with lots of alleged silliness. When it comes to dialogue with the survivors, not all of them are deep and meaningful. Some are there purely for comic relief, or, not even talking about escorting them, just to annoy the heck out of you. Like Ronald. This guy. However, there are several serious survivor interactions such as Leah, Ross and Tanya, and Simone's. One of the earliest survivors you can find is Leah. She has by far the darkest background of any survivors. She describes how her infant daughter was eaten by zombies, and chillingly says, "I've never heard her cry like that." Frank is barely able to convince her to come with him to safety. The second most harrowing is probably Ross and Tanya's, assuming you handle them a certain way. Ross has been injured, and it takes some dialogue to get him and Tanya to come with you. If you're foolish enough to honor Ross's request to give him a gun, however, he will kill himself. To my earlier point, these are scattered moments that players are not always able to find on their initial playthroughs. It makes the story of Dead Rising feel all the more real and visceral. You won't be able to see all these things in one run until you come up with a nearly flawless schedule, which itself kind of ruins the desperate feeling of the game by turning it into something of a mathematical problem and not an ongoing experience, but that's a whole separate issue. To continue with this example though, let's talk about the psychos. Psychos are the opposite of survivors, where you have to fight them rather than rescue them, with the exception of one. We know the backstories of some better than others, and again, some of them are sillier than others.
This is my sword!
To highlight some examples, although it is not directly said, Adam the Clown is speculated by fans of Dead Rising to have witnessed an entire audience of children be devoured by zombies, which caused his breakdown. Larry Chang, with his polite attitude towards Frank, gives off the impression that he was a pretty nice fellow before he lost his mind. And of course, I have to talk about Cliff. There's a reason he's a fan favorite. Cliff is by far the most sympathetic of the psychos outside of maybe, and it's a big maybe, Carlito. His Vietnam background makes him immediately sympathetic to most American players, and his death scene is handled with way more dignity than any other psychos in the game.
When I heard her scream, I just lost it. Everything went white. Suddenly, the war. It wasn't over. Not for me. It never ended.
The way Frank respectfully listens and shuts Cliff's eyes after his death says more than any words of comfort Frank could have tried to say. In all, for every unsubtle and exaggerated stereotype we see among the survivors and psychos, there's a sobering moment to remind the player of the horrifying reality of the situation these people find themselves in. As erumore says in his video,
"These people are characters who feel like they have their own story, however little of it we may have seen as the player."
In addition to all the prior examples, it's Frank's reaction to them that ultimately makes these characters easier to take at face value, which brings me to my last topic. Ah yes, the piece de resistance of Dead Rising's writing. Frank is a perfect character for Dead Rising because it is he who grounds everything for us as players. We see everything through his eyes. It only makes sense then that Frank has what can best be described as an everyman archetype. A quick definition of the everyman is a character who is your average guy, plain and simple. He's not super powerful or smart or unique, he is just some guy until the story kicks off, which eventually leads him to being more than just some guy. Think R.J. McCready from The Thing or the narrator in Fight Club. Dead Rising's portrayal of the Everman was delivered on the developer's part too. In a 2006 interview with Dead Rising's producer, Keiji Inafune, he said, "What we wanted to go after with Dead Rising was an everyman, your average sort of person. Not anybody that looks super cool, not anybody that looks super ugly. Frank is just that. He's a random freelance photojournalist who, out of all the journalists in the country, just so happened to be the one to get into Willamette. It could have been anybody, and that makes it all the easier for the player to get into the game, since the player can make Frank as resourceful or strong as they want. On top of that, there's still plenty of space for players to enjoy Frank's actual personality. One thing that makes Frank stand out so much is something that fans miss on occasion. While he can be a big snark, you come to realize he actually doesn't say much. During Cliff, Adam, and the convicts' cutscenes, Frank doesn't say a single thing. He just takes it all in and lets the audience make their own observations. It's one of the best things about him as a character. He only speaks when he has to. It is the perfect trait to encapsulate his status as an everyman. The everyman isn't dropping stupid one-liners and winking at the camera, and that's what makes Frank feel all the more real and sympathetic to the player. I also think it's important to bring up what Frank's voice actor, TJ Rotolo, was bringing to the table when it comes to the everyman archetype. Rotolo cited some interesting characters when it came to his portrayal of Frank.
For Frank, I always think of Clint Eastwood and Mickey Rourke. Okay. And it's like that's kind of you know, I'm trying to like do a marriage of Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry and Mickey Rourke, you know, from like The Wrestler or something like that. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of my main thing, you know, in doing Frank.
All of these characters slash actors are notable for their masculine qualities. Generally, an everyman character is going to be aimed at men. Let's be real. Women can enjoy and relate to such characters too, of course, but there's a reason that most Dead Rising content is made and enjoyed by men. It's a game clearly aimed at the male audience, so Frank being portrayed with several masculine qualities makes him appealing and relatable to the male player base. There's another everyman archetype that shines through Frank's character. In Frank, one can make many parallels to the detective protagonists of film noirs from the 40s to 50s. I know this is a big jump, but stay with me here. One that particularly comes to mind is Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer character, who most famously appeared in the influential 1955 classic Kiss Me Deadly. Now, Hammer is more Brutus than Frank. Actually, never mind. While Hammer is more Brutus towards people and not quite as shrewd as Frank, that rough around the edges, machismo, smart aleck, driven, and sometimes manipulative attitude give Frank all the markings of a noir protagonist like Hammer.
How much do you already know? Have you called for help?
Hold your horses, babe. I'm the one asking the questions here.
I bring up all this analysis of Frank as a masculine character because it's his drive, not counting player input, that pushes Dead Rising's main plot forward. If Frank hadn't been crazy enough to go to Willamette in the first place, the story never would have happened. It's also this attitude of Frank's, where he knows the situation is more hopeless than not, but he still keeps going, that lends itself to the Gravitas. And even as he keeps going, his cynical edge cannot help but come out.
You're lucky, Frank. You seem to have a very high level of resistance.
So what you're saying is that I get to spend longer waiting for the inevitable. Is that it? You know, I'm not sure lucky is the word I'd use.
Yet, despite this, the player slowly discovers that Frank really is a good man at heart. He refused to leave behind survivors who were ready to give up and die. His treatment of Cliff during Cliff's death scene is full of sympathy. His reaction to Brad's turning is also one of a man who's come to view the other as a friend. If Frank could just get one more clue, just save one more person, maybe all of the madness will have been worth it. To end off this section, two of the biggest moments where Frank's gravitas is on full display are in the game's true endings. These endings, A and then S, which you have to get after A, are similar. The final true ending has Frank, after defeating the worst final boss ever, falling to his knees and screaming into the air out of agony while zombies surround him and Isabella. But somehow he gets out of it, because we need those sequels. This is Frank letting all of his desperation, all of his despair manifest itself. He's finally giving up, as far as we can tell. But it's ending A that portrays its concept better in my opinion, as it's much more subdued. Here, Frank gets to the mall's rooftop to meet his helicopter in time. Frank and the pilot are overjoyed to see each other, only for the helicopter to crash. Frank, in shock and despair, falls to his knees as zombies slowly come from behind and start to surround him. Then, the credits roll. As obvious as this rug pull downer ending is to anyone who has seen a 70s to 80s horror movie, it's still incredibly effective and just mwah, chef's kiss. It's the crowning moment of the game's desperate and heavy mood. All of the gravitas is built up to this beautifully tragic ending. You can feel the weight Frank has on his shoulders as it dawns on him that this was all for nothing. He will never escape Willamette. Until he does. Even though the game does not fully make good on its downer ending, Dead Rising is amazing with how it captures several distinct elements of character. There's a real emotional weight to the game, gravitas. People would not keep playing this game if the only thing they wanted to do was hack and slash a bunch of zombies in a mall. I mean, you could do that in Gmod or something. Dead Rising 1 brings people back again and again because there's real intelligence in its writing. Capcom's writers knew they weren't making a silly zombie game. They were telling a story with dignified characters. Characters that they wanted to feel like real people. Characters who make players ask themselves, what would I do in this situation? My only hope for the future of Dead Rising is, if another game does come out, I just hope the story and characters have as much gravitas put into them as the ones in the first. Just don't make another Kent, that SOB can die.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.